to present Dr. Roberto Viola. Roberto Viola is Director General of DG Connect at the European Commission. He was Deputy Director General of DG Connect in the past, and we are very happy and honored to have him here with us to give also the much needed policy perspective to our meeting. So without further ado, I'm very happy to give the floor now to Roberto Viola. Thank you very much for being with us. I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Sarto. Thank you for the invitation. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. And as you said, I'm Director General of the European Commission Department, DG Connect, that deals with all the digital policies. So the policy making, law making, regulation, and also all the part that is related to research and development. And in my DG, also we have the responsibility for the policies in robotics, artificial intelligence. So what I would like to do today is try to give you what is the perspective of the European Commission when dealing with AI, with robotics, and what to do in terms of organizing the European policies and the European legislation. Many of you have quoted directives, activities that we have done in the past, will do in the future in regulating economy and society, and it's beyond any doubt, beside, the natural hype where something new happens, that AI is transformative, some would say it's disruptive, and will influence economy and society. AI per se is not new. When I was graduating already, there was quite some activity in AI. What makes now AI particularly interesting and important is that now AI can use the data. There are data, massive amounts of data available. AI can use very powerful computers. So the combination of computing power and availability of data makes now AI something that is more of a dream or something that you find in a novel of science fiction or in university paper. It makes something that starts to be concrete and real. So what we have done, we are preparing you need an AI agent that immediately. So we are preparing for policy making, for steering the research activity, for the regulation in AI. I hope in an orderly and progressive fashion. And to do that, we have published 3 weeks ago the European strategy to AI, and also a number of policy papers. Some of those I heard today have been quoted on what to do in various aspects. Now, the first thing I would like to say, the message that we want to pass, and we are trying to pass, is that the introduction of AI and whatever is about utilizing data, it's a good story. So it's a story that for the society, for the economy, it's bearing the sign plus. When you look at whatever sector, the advantages of using AI and robotics and digital disruptive technologies are evident. Take the medicine sector with personalized medicine. Take the automotive sector. I remind all of you that more than 90% of the accidents, car accidents, are generated because of human error. The introduction of AI, whatever sector, it's bringing a sign plus. No one has ordered humans to work 40 hours at least per week. I'm sure you do even more. No one has ordered humans to work in dangerous working places or to do dangerous activities. If those activities can be done by robots, it's better for the humans. So there cannot be any association of AI robotics with the disruption of workforce to a point that there will be the sign of minus instead of plus. All of this is the starting point, is the outset. Because if this is the outset, then the policy perspective has to be the first thing that policymakers have to do is to reap the benefits of AI, to make sure that the society profits from AI. Because if the sign is the other one, then the first reflex should be to protect, to increase the level of regulation, to make sure we stop innovation. That's not the case. So no wonder that most of our policy paper, it's about this is important. It's important for Europe, it's important for the world. Europe has its responsibilities in the world in terms of advancing in the right direction, and we want to take this responsibility and bring it further. Of course, at the same time, it would be a bit too much of a candid policy paper if we just say, look, it's all nice, and believe in it. There are issues that needs to be studied, considered, but not necessarily we need to rush into conclusion. So, looking at what are the issues, of course, one issue is the way the labor market, the professions evolve in terms of what kind of necessity we will have in the future in terms of skills, how we need to reskill the working population, how we need to upskill the working population, how we need to prepare the future generation of workers, what kind of skills are necessary. There's one thing that maybe you know, it's called truck platooning, which is quite real, by the way. We are already experimenting in many highways, one truck after the other in automatic drive mode. It's a sort of train of trucks. A future truck driver, it's more a programmer than a driver. So you see, even, I mean, certain jobs that today have low content in terms of digital literacy will have a much higher content in the future. And that's a societal challenge. I think we need to discuss it now, prepare now for the future. So, and this also prevents a rather populistic approach to all of this, that this is just about losing jobs, this is about a society that is collectively failing, and the only way, what is the only reflex possible, to close borders, to dig holes, and go back, I mean, to pre-industrial economy, because this is the only way to save the humanity. To instead, I mean, present the advantages, present clearly what is the path towards, I mean, transforming the working population in a direction that can use at best those technologies, we think this is a way to counteract all those forms of populism. Then there's a third element, which is, of course, very relevant for the topic you are discussing today, which is what kind of new ethics, if we need to develop ethical principle, and probably we do, what kind of new constitutional principle, what kind of new legislative actions we need around AI. And of course, this is a rather serious work, and again, there are various levels of this problem. So what I will try to do in the rest of my talk is to try to dig into these various levels and try to give our contribution as policymakers, how we see this, let's say, interaction between different policy levels. The first point is, looking at AI, do we need some sort of horizontal legislation that cuts across all the various sectors and sets a number of principles? Well, first of all, some of you said it, we need to understand what we are talking about. So, what is AI? In our policy paper, we try to define it, and admittedly, we have done it in a relatively simplistic way, because this policy paper, our ambition is that they are read by everyone. Here we can be slightly more sophisticated, and we could say whatever breaks a little bit the causality principle by creating an expectation of the future, which is not totally deterministic, of course in a probabilistic way, starts to be an AI agent. So it's something that introduces an output which is not totally predetermined in terms of repetitive testing. So this element that breaks the causality makes it a bit different from the traditional machines and all the rest, and makes it then puzzling for those that maintain all the EU legislation, consumer law, machines, and products, and whatever. And I'll quickly go into this. But then this is one aspect of the problem. The other one is about the data, because the reason why this behavior becomes complex is because those entities and those agents absorb data. So this attracts the whole discussion about what kind of regulation we want to data. So this month, actually a few days, the General Data Protection Regulation will enter into force in Europe, which means all over Europe there will be the same rules for data protection. We have rules for open data in Europe, how to regulate data generated by public entities. We don't regulate the exchange of data between two private parties. Of course, if those exchanges violate competition law, we have the remedies. Otherwise, those exchange of data are normally not regulated ex ante. Do we maintain for the time being this equilibrium? For the time being, this is our answer. So we will continue looking at privacy as a fundamental right of the citizens. We will continue and even do more to force public entities to open their data. But we do not want, neither intend for the time being, to regulate the exchange of data between private entities. But we do have published some ideas, one policy idea of examples, role models that can be followed in exchanging data. Of course, this is again a little bit simplistic, because when take, for instance, autonomous car, there are data which are necessary by public authorities in order to understand and regulate better, and the same applies to health data. So these business to public data exchanges can be regulated, and they are at times, take for instance in case of mobility, regulated by the sectoral legislation. Now, so when I then go into the horizontal world, you can have a sort of four-quadrant world. The regulation around data, the regulation around liability, the regulation around contract law, and whatever has to do also with consumer law, and the regulation on how you generate value, how you tax this value, what, I mean, could be attracted in public law sphere. Now, scanning all this, we still are convinced that the approach has to be problem-oriented. If we find a problem, we try to solve the problem, rather than kind of having a sort of abstract view of what needs to be done and then do legislation. And that, as you know, is the primary rule of doing legislation in the European Union. Every time we present a new legislation, we are obliged, and my people suffer every day from this, to present an economic impact assessment, a technical impact assessment of what is the impact. And we go in front of an independent board that judges us on the quality and value of this legislation. I would wish that national parliament would do the same. So looking at, for instance, the issue around, I already discussed a little bit about data, but looking at now at the issue of liability, of course, the first question that comes to our minds, and I heard today discussing this in the liability session, is do we need to change our defective product liability directive? Second question, do you need to change the machinery directive? Well, here the question is very much related to this problem of causality. And basically, it's the equilibrium between the responsibility of whoever supplies the, let's call it entity, the AI agent in the form of organized machine or in the form of a software, and whoever utilizes it. Because this is the basis of the European law, this equilibrium between the manufacturer of the good and the user of the good and the responsibilities that they share. And of course, according to the type of good, there are this equilibrium moves a little bit more towards the manufacturer, a little bit more towards the user. And especially, I mean, our case law are going in the direction is that if the user is causing all harmful actions in utilizing something, then the equilibrium of the liability moves in the direction of the user. Now, here we are all tempted to say, look, the equilibrium for something like an auto-programmed drone or something like an autonomous car should move more in the direction of the manufacturer rather than the user. But of course, this is complex because the manufacturer cannot, in a predetermined way, test all possible outputs of this particular entity. So, how we get around this? I don't have the answer. If you, for instance, look at what is civil law today about pets, you say pets, why pets? Well, a cat is, can jump much more than a man, no? The human being. So it's a sort of enhancement of, take, for instance, someone going hunting, on a natural enhancement of the capability of the human being since the ancient time. The civil law has evolved by saying the owner of the pet has the responsibility for the irrational behavior of the pet, as you know. So an aggressive pet that cannot be predetermined because this can happen, the responsibility lies on the owner. So even if maybe it comes from some genetic defect and the poor owner has bought this pet with the genetic defect. This to say that what we are reflecting a little bit is that the way AI is tested then becomes really, really important here. When you take, for instance, drugs, something that we authorized the European Commission to circulate, I mean, that's now a rather codified way in the US, in Europe, elsewhere, to allow drugs to be circulated in the market. And is it the deterministic test of someone in front of a commission takes a pill and then the commission watches what happened? No. It is the result of repetitive and progressive tests of what is the outcome of this particular medication throughout time. We are starting to think that AI agents are a little bit like this, that you need a testing environment by which you start to progressively repeat and test what is going to be the likely behavior. And this in a way to cover many, many, many possible user scenarios and instances to be reasonably sure in a scientific way that the outcome stays in the range of something which is not harmful in the, of course, legal meaning of being harmful. But this is something that, of course, requires, I mean, quite a number of steps in terms of investments, in terms of public entities being ready for this. So that's why, jumping to the conclusion, here there's a problem of causality. Then immediately we have to change all our directives of liability is too much of a simplistic story. And that's why in my team, the people working on launching all the new research and innovation activities and the people working in legislation are absolutely working together. Now, if I go into the area of public law, someone evoked the idea of obligatory insurance, which is per se not a bad idea. There's a big debate, big or small, but relatively important considering the people that evoke this debate, on taxing whatever is generated by intelligent agents, taxing the production of robots in a different way than taxing labor, which is to say, I mean, if you wash dishes with a washing machine, you should be taxed because that's a robot that washes the dishes, if I can simplify. If I can be a bit more sophisticated, clearly, if we have to work less, because we will have to work less, then the number of hours that will be taxed will be less. So that to maintain the equilibrium, something has to happen. Now, again, I don't think, first of all, we are not convinced of the idea that, I mean, taxing the innovation is the way forward. And we are not at all sure that we have the body of evidence that allows us to jump immediately to the conclusion that whatever is robotics and automation should be taxed more to whatever is other things. And that is just a little bit of a panorama. I can entertain you for days, but I'm sure there are many more important talks after me and also many things to see in Florence. If I go quickly into the sectorial legislation and what to do, of course, there are sectors which are more in this moment intercepted by the hype than others. Of course, the first one that comes to the mind of all of us is the automotive sector. Now, the best thing to do there would be to have an agreement to change the Vienna Convention that regulates liability, responsibility for vehicles. And in particular, the Article 8 of the Vienna Convention that sets the responsibility basically of the driver, whatever happens. Now, we are enthusiastically participating to the work in the UN to do the work, but I don't see the same enthusiasm from other parts of the world, in US, on China, to accelerate the work on the Vienna Convention. This, of course, leads to the conclusion that probably the legislation on autonomous vehicles will start locally, so to say, locally. You are well aware of the Self-Driving Act that has been proposed in the United States, which is a bit of a framework legislation that basically sets the federal responsibility. We are not planning tomorrow to do the same, also because we do have a number of legislation around testing cars and car type approval. At the same time, we believe that what we have proposed is the right way. So basically, to have a flexibility to say the human can hand over the control to the car, but of course the human must be ready to take over control again, which is a step, of course. It's not the final step, but it's a step towards what are the high level of autonomous, which are, are classified 1 to 5. This is called level 4 and level 5. In the health sector, again, we have a number of European legislations. We are, again, asking the same question, what we do about the medical device legislation, what we do about the safety. And it's interesting, again, the US-European perspective. The Food and Drug Administration, US, recently approved intelligent pills that you actually ingest, and they give you a number of information, including when you have to take the pill or what is the effect. In the European Union, this will be considered a medical device. not a drug. So that's an interesting subtlety. So it's now to understand whether a medical protocol, take for instance medical protocols that do exist to spot melanoma, based on AI, is considered a medicament or is considered a medical device. Normally in Europe we would consider them medical device, but the normal I would question, to be honest. The other case that keeps us busy is financial markets. We have presented in March our strategy for fintech, and financial activities are highly regulated in Europe, and there are also sort of flourishing community of regulators around this. And of course, many of the things that AI introduces are a little bit putting in question the relationship between the actors, the actor being the final users of financial services, or the business-to-business relationship of financial actors. There, I would say, there are main questions around, first of all, the transparency. When you get an investment advice, is it from a machine or from a human agent? Should the user know about that an AI agent is in the loop? All the questions, if we move more into the business-to-business of high-frequency trading and the stability questions that high-frequency trading introduces. There, and I'm moving towards what we think we should do in the short term, in fintech, but that applies also to medtech to a certain extent. We are introducing and believing that regulatory sandboxes are probably a very good thing. What is a regulatory sandbox? Is basically telling the local regulator, look, for a while, say a few months, 1 year, if you have a startup that comes really with an interesting idea, you can waive certain regulation. You can lessen the intensity of the regulation to allow some innovation. Now, in financial services, this is particularly complicated because all the regulation is European. So the local regulator, I mean, is a bit of a problem to waive the European regulation. But that's why it's also our responsibility to say, yes, I mean, let's go and see case by case whether we can create for AI sandboxes in the area of health, in the area of financial services. And that's what we said in our strategy. Now, the final point I want to make is it's all about, I mean, complex but legislation which is sort of second level of the legislative process. What about the Grundnorm, the basis, the constitutional basis of all what we do? Are our, which then also touch on ethical values, the way we approach things. Is it all okay, or there's something to be done? And there, of course, again, what comes really on the spot, looking also at some worrisome example coming from China, is will human being remain the master of their future, yes or no? You know that China has introduced the government screening of the possibility to have a loan based on AI. Now, if an AI agent decides whether I can get a loan, whether my kids can go to school, whether I can get a job with an eye scan and data mining of all what I've done in social media, is it in line with the DNA of our society, yes or no? I would say, probably most of you in this room would say no, because one of the basic elements, constitutional elements of our society is that we own our future in many respects. Are we ready tomorrow to change, I mean, the fundamental laws? No, probably no, but I think this research, these activities on ethics and principle on ethics has to go ahead. So what we decided to do is to create two things. First of all, an AI alliance that will really include all possible actors around the AI. And then an expert group, some of you in this room have applied for this expert group, of highly qualified experts that will help us in working with the alliance and prepare a charter. Now, first of all, this will be a charter of the alliance, I mean, so self-regulation at its best, but maybe certain elements of this charter can be considered further on in terms of what we should do in terms of the future European legislation at all possible levels. At the same time, we will go ahead with the idea of sandboxes. At the same time, we will go ahead with the idea that we'll continue to insist with the sort of European model to AI, which is the blending of these three things. I mean, the idea that AI is a plus for the society, we must invest in this direction, especially looking at public services. The idea that, I mean, work needs to be transformed and we need to invest in skills. And the idea that we don't need to rush to change legislation, but we have to work all together with the scientific community, and that's why I'm really pleased to be here today to actually prepare for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this interesting overview of the strategy of the European Commission. And I'm particularly interested on your suggestion about the comparison with drugs. Because also in studying artificial intelligence and big data, I start from this kind of perspective. So the idea that having a more regulated production of innovation in this sector. And I think that this may be the European approach. So not an approach based on creating value per se from mere economic perspective, but having also sort of an assessment of what we put on the market. And in this sense, the main challenges in this case is that this may reduce the things that we can create. This is a typical objection that I receive from the companies. They say, if you want to adopt a system that tried and test everything before, this reduces innovation. And so this was my question, how we can address this kind of observation, and moreover, which is the role of civic engagement in this potential system based on a sort of selection of the products that we put on the market based on AI. Thanks.
Thank you. It's a good question. Let me give you an approximate answer. And I do it with an example which is a real one. So we are proposed a new legislation on cybersecurity, which is called the European Cybersecurity Act, which is right now in Parliament, and we hope that will be approved quite soon. The European Cybersecurity Act introduces the certification, the cybersecurity certification. It's a bottom-up process. So we are not saying which product, services, or people should be certified. We are saying, look, if you industry come with something you think is relevant from the certification point of view, this is the way you can actually certify it in a way that everyone in Europe recognizes the same certification scheme. And this has been quite a deliberate choice for the reason you say. I mean, because if we start to say IoT for security in the house, yes, we certify. Instead, drones we don't certify, or whatever. The list is, first of all, open-ended. Secondly, I mean, you never know whether you are stifling innovation, you are not intercepting. Of course, when it comes to public security, public safety, probably the public sphere will say what needs to be certified. But in general, it should be bottom-up. And I think this is more or less the way we want to go ahead. Why we say more or less? Because if we have analyzed the WannaCry accident, also from the point of view of liability. Now, those systems that being affected, there's been a very severe user misbehavior because there was no update of the software. And this cannot be, let's say, the responsibility of whoever has certified the software or the manufacturer, but it's basically, again, in this equilibrium that is sort of pendulum that swings, is the responsibility of the user, or the system user of that particular. So whatever certification scheme you invent, even whatever sophisticated AI testing scheme you have, in front of gross misbehavior, that's difficult, I mean, to counteract. So my answer is, first of all, the certification also for AI has to be bottom-up. My second answer is, of course, from the public perspective, you have also to give the opportunity to certify. That's why we are proposing now a new program, which is called Digital Europe program, that in the AI part will establish test and certification centers, where scientists, where specialists can actually work and test those things, because otherwise who's testing it, where you are testing, what kind of, certainty and scientific credibility you give to your testing system.
Sure, thank you. I just wanted to drill down a bit on your comment and the discussion about social credit scoring, which you mentioned in China. And I think, obviously, intuitively, there are some concerns on breaches of fundamental rights where this kind of system becomes too invasive. But of course, there are also potential benefits. For example, people who otherwise couldn't have accessed credit but can because data shows that they're more creditworthy than they would otherwise have been seen. So my question is simply, what do you see as the solution? Do you see it as one of limiting the kinds of data that can be used? Is it to say that nothing can be fully automated, there must be a human in the loop? What would be the solution?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very good question, and you are right. I mean, my simplistic answer is probably human in the loop. A bit more sophisticated answer, when you look, for instance, at the insurance market, is to say that there should be a sort of universal coverage for those that, the machines are screening that you cannot be life insured, for instance. So the system has to have its own compensation, because you will end up in a situation, and you are right, that using big data and AI, you could minimize the overall insurance cost of it. Then you say, plus, yeah, but at the cost of a part of the population that will never be insured. So what you do for that part of the population? Human in the loop, or you say, okay, let's have a sort of universal service type of compensation for those categories.
My question is about fragmentation, understood in two different ways. We said that, I said at least in my presentation at the very beginning that robots are not, and AI are not going to be so radically changing our legal system, so we don't need to throw away everything we have. Yet, one thing that everybody I think in the room would agree upon is that they are very different kind of technologies, and they might require different kind of solutions. So for instance, not to say that we have to do away with the product liability directive, but we might need to fragment it, to cut it, like to have specific rules for specific sets of applications that might be better rules for that class of application. So would that be feasible? And the other issue of fragmentation that is actually the opposite. You said, for instance, that driverless cars won't be regulated at EU level because there will be national initiatives. But there are studies, at least some of my research goes in direction to show that liability rules and other rules as well shape the way technology develops. So if we have German rules that will favor a certain kind of application, French rules slightly different, will favor a different kind of application, Italian rules, so on and so forth, that could fragment the market. Is that a concern?
Thank you. I think you touched 2 points. So on the Product Liability Directive, a few months ago when we started, there were 3 options basically. I mean, to start the revision right away, to go in the step of a recommendation, how to apply the Product Liability Directive, and the third one, which we have chosen, is to establish a group of experts and go a bit more slowly into this, because we don't see, as you were saying, and I agree, nothing dramatic that is happening tomorrow that we have to rush into changing. But we do have to change the Product Liability Directive. That is clear. It's the time frame now. We will do it. We will do with the help of the experts, with the stakeholders, but we will take a little bit of time. I guess not too much, will get a little bit of time. The second point is, do we like fragmented rules? I think this, in AI or advanced digital technology, it would be a disaster in Europe if we start to have different. I refer to the type approval of cars that we have in Europe that more or less is working, it's fine, but I mean, when it comes to autonomous car, I think, and that's why, by the way, the US rushed in to say this is federal competence. I mean, we need basically to say the same. I mean, there's no doubt that the rules about autonomous car have to be European rules. Better, I said, world rules, but I have little confidence that we can change the Vienna Convention tomorrow. So as a minimum, European rules.
Roberto, you conclude really on what I wanted to ask. Europe, I mean, the way you are presenting it, there is a clear view. AI is a plus. We know that work has to transform and will be transformed by artificial intelligence, and we don't rush to regulate. But we have the historical experience. AI is a general purpose technology, will change many things together. And we had an experience a few years ago with internet that did exactly the same thing. Can Europe have its own position, or in a comparative approach? The question is what American will do, what the Chinese, I mean, are we able to be on the coordination of this? There is a place where there is a discussion of this.
Pierluigi, thanks for quoting Internet, because as you know, I'm also, my DG is also responsible for the Internet rules and net neutrality. Now, Europe now is the only area where we have legislative net neutrality rules in place in the world. And I think they are not too bad, by the way. But it took some time because you remember, because I remember we discussed a few years ago, we tried to understand what was the problem. Because at the beginning, everyone was speaking at net neutrality, and we could not even understand why we were speaking of non-discrimination, bottleneck access, what it was. Once, I mean, the dust started to settle, we presented our framework legislation that has been, let's say, declined by the regulators, and surprise, surprise, now we are alone in the world. But I would say with a decent piece of legislation that allows free internet to be one of the solid rock principles in Europe. So that's a lesson that we have learned, and I think that's a little bit, I mean, the same that I'm tempted to say here. With an we will bring those instances in international forum. We will have to do our own work, that's clear, and we will do our own work. There's probably a notable exception where little Europe cannot do the sort of own reflection, which is in an area which is traditionally an area where the UN, the community of nations have to decide together, which is when AI is applied to defense or weapons. Should we ban AI from weapons? Some would say a little bit like the insurance debate, the little one we had, yeah, but it minimizes the cost. It minimizes because AI attack system will be programmed with the idea of minimizing the side effect, if we can call them side effect. Others would say, human in the loop. This is not human in the loop. So this is a debate that can only take place at world level. It cannot, I mean, yes, Europe probably will come with a relatively solid, peaceful tradition and some ideas, but this is something that will have to be discussed at worldwide level. First, we have to, of course, get an act together in Europe, but then it's something. And there are many other things, by the way. Use AI in the developing world to help, I mean, agriculture to be better. So there are many things that go beyond the European level. But this is still a very, very complicated Himalaya climbing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Viola, for being with us and for presenting us so many urgent issues in the deployment of AI and answering also so many questions. Thanks a lot. I'm happy now to give the floor to the chair of the next session on data protection and cybersecurity, which will be Francesca Bosco. There is a little change with regard to the program. Francesca has been working on legal issues of internet and AI for quite some time, and she's a research officer at UNICRI, which is the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute. I'm very happy to have Francesca, which is also a friend, here with us today. And
thanks for saying for quite some times without saying exactly how many years. It was very kind of you. You're a gentleman. So thank you so much, Giovanni. Thank you so much. Thanks for, I mean, I'm very happy that all this came together, and I'm very, very pleased to see all the distinguished speakers and also the public. Thanks a lot. I would cut my my initial speech for time constraint, because I really would like to give the floor to our distinguished speakers, first of all, and secondly, because I really think that the speech that we just heard from Mr. Viola was extremely good to introduce actually the challenges that we're facing in Europe and outside Europe, and I think we all agree that, I mean, nowadays security and privacy are at the bottom, at the core of all economic sectors, and robotics is not an exception. I think that the two main things were highlighted, among others, were the, let's say, needed multi-stakeholder and holistic approach when we are discussing about these issues, and I really appreciate the EU strategy really naming also the fact that we need to have such a sort of like comprehensive approach in listening to all the different competencies and expertise that you have at the table, and therefore that's also why when we were thinking about this event, we really would like to have for sure a sort of like academic endeavor, but also to have roboticists, to have experts from a legal point of view, from a policy point of view, computer scientists and security and privacy experts to get together and try to reason and to discuss about the challenges that we're facing. But also, I think it's important to understand which are the fundamental concepts that are challenged by AI and robotics, and that's why I'm very happy to have this panel. The idea of the panel is to go from the discussion of challenges to fundamental concepts like privacy and data protection, and we will have a Berjap introducing this. But also to the impact that the current regulation has in specific sectors, like, for example, the startup and namely the GDPR. And then we will have a sort of like a little bit of a shift in try to understand also how algorithmic algorithms and algorithmic decision making might be regulated, if there's a need to regulate them, how we can regulate them, and how maybe GDPR is seen also from outside the ocean. I'm very glad to start the panel, so I leave the floor to Berjap. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I actually would prefer to stand. I'm not sure whether that works sufficiently. Because this way I can better see and be seen, although I did take the I don't want to be recorded or filmed button on my consent form. So that's a challenge for the cameraman. Thank you very much for the invitation here. I will neither speak on cybersecurity nor on data protection, and yet I do hope that the presentation is relevant. And I'll try to show why. I'm currently working on privacy and particularly on finding new ways to protect privacy in law. And we need, I think, new concepts, what I call boundary marking concepts for that. I will briefly introduce the background of that research, and which also requires me to go back to the basics, the age-old question of what is privacy actually. And then I'll try to apply that to robotics and AI in order to bring the point across that we should discuss more elements than just data protection and the GDPR. And as far as time allows, I will give some ideas on where the future might lie for new concepts to protect privacy in a smart world. Let's start with the background of my research project currently, and this is a good way of introducing it. A very common occurrence is that the police arrest someone on the street, and traditionally they have then the power to just frisk the person and seize the objects that they carry with them. Without any judicial warrant, simply because it's usually urgent and there might be evidence in there that the police wants to see. Nowadays, of course, most people will carry a smartphone with them, and if under the same doctrine a police officer on the street could simply just seize the smartphone and look at all the contents, because that's included in the doctrine, that creates a bit more of a privacy challenge than it used to. This is from a slide presented by a policeman who tried to convince his fellow police officers how much useful information there is in smartphones. The US has the Riley case, where they said, because of this, you really need a judicial warrant. But many other countries still apply the old doctrine that because you're being arrested somewhere in public, you can just seize anything that the person carries with them. The underlying problem there is that we protect privacy particularly under the paradigm of spatial privacy, my home is my castle, and so your private life is particularly protected in your private spaces. And the underlying assumption there used to be in the 19th and 20th century that most of the private things happened at home, and you left most of your private stuff at home. And that, of course, is no longer the case. Not only is it now possible to look inside the home without entering it, and you can get a lot of information from what happens in the home just by collecting data outside of the home, but particularly most people will carry most of the things that they used to leave in their houses with them on the smartphone in the cloud. Think of music, books, diaries, letters, all kinds of stuff. There is another aspect to that, namely that public space, which used not to be so privacy sensitive, is now becoming more privacy sensitive because of developments in ubiquitous camera surveillance, location tracking technologies, and with the advent of automated facial recognition combined with things such as Google Glass, where anyone might recognize strangers on the street, I think also that we need to really think about privacy in public spaces. And so combining these trends, the starting point of my research is that where law still relies to a significant extent, particularly in criminal law and criminal procedure, which is my field of expertise, on the distinction between private places and public places, that distinction is no longer valid to distinguish between major and minor privacy intrusions. So we need to think about new concepts that can mark the boundaries between what is really private and what is a bit less private, if you want to regulate what, for instance, the police can do. And to do so, I have a 5-year project. I'm now in the 4th, almost 5th year, so I'm in the 3rd stage. So supposedly we have already generated new concepts, and I have 2 that I might present if time allows at the end, where we try to see how those concepts could be operationalized. And it's a very nice project with 5 people from different disciplines. I won't bother you too much with that. one of the elements that I needed to do in the project, because asking how can we protect privacy, I need to have some understanding of what is privacy. So one of the things we did in the project is to think at a conceptual level of privacy and privacy protection in law. And this is just a thinking exercise, what I call a conceptual history of how privacy developed in law, which is no way historically embedded, but this is more how I think of it conceptually. The basic starting point is the body as the closest thing that you have or that you are, which used to be protected in law for a long time. Then also the home started to be protected centuries ago as the private space where the King of England could not enter. Then we got communications. Letters have been protected, and I think you can think of letters as a kind of secure channel between private spaces. So you write a letter in the private space of your home, someone else reads it in the private space of their home, and you entrust it to someone, and what the law does is protect the channel through which you send the letter. Then you get the telephone. That is roughly similar to a letter in terms of you have a communication channel, and the law protects the secrecy of communication still. So it protects the channel from being eavesdropped upon. With mobile phones, it gets a little bit more complicated because the connection between the private space where you have the communications becomes far less, but you still protect the channel through which communications go. And then you get the computer, and there something interesting happens, I think. In the 1970s, when discussions started on how should we regulate all the data processing by computers, the law decided to protect not the computer, but the data. So we have personal data protection. But in contrast to most of the previous ones, what data protection law protects is the contents, not the container. And interestingly, if you think of it from the perspective that I sketched, what the law usually does is protect the environment, not what you do in the environment. So it protects the container and not the content. And that, I think, is one reason why privacy and data protection are really different animals, and why we should also think of that in a different way. And one interesting element to consider is that whereas data protection only protects the data and not the computer, which might make sense from several perspectives, you see, for instance, with the German constitutional decision on protecting the integrity and confidentiality of computer systems, which they came up with a couple of years ago, was one response to finding that the law as it was in the previous developments could not protect what happened inside computers and the way that police accessed computers. So a second way of presenting my story and the conceptual framework of privacy is to present briefly the typology of privacy that we developed with my team in the project. You might have seen this, and apologies for those who've seen the presentation before, but I'll very briefly go through the elements of this. We started with identifying the zones of life from the very private, your own person with no one else, with increasing social interactions to the public zone. Noting also that privacy has an element of both negative freedoms and positive freedoms. The negative freedom of don't enter, don't bother with me, I want to be left alone. But it also has many elements of self-development, autonomy, of being able to do what you want to do. And there is a third dimension that we distinguished, which is the distinction between the elements of privacy that I can control through access limitation, so I decide who I want to get close to me. And there are also many elements of privacy where it's not really my access control, but where it's, and this is called control in the US debate, access versus control, but it's actually discretion, I now find would be a better term, because this is the way that privacy relies often on other people's discretion. So on this side you see more the privacy elements that I can control myself through boundary management. And this is more the social norms types of privacy protection, where you don't ask me questions about my sex life, for example, at least not during this presentation. In other contexts you might want to do so, but not in this context. Having set out these dimensions, we were able to find the 8 different types of privacy that we found most commonly in the literature and in the law in a quite neat way. And I won't present them now, but I'll briefly go through them applied to robotics and AI. And one element that I think distinguishes this typology from many other efforts to get a list of privacy types is that we found that, of course, informational privacy is also important. So important that it has a central role here, meaning that it overlaps with many of the types of privacy that we distinguished. So it's not just a 9th type of privacy, it's actually a cross-cutting type of privacy that overlaps with each one, but it's not equatable with it. So most elements, when you talk about privacy, have an element of the data that are being processed, but they also usually have an element that is not reducible to the data being processed. And to highlight that, I'll briefly now go through some applications in robotics and AI. But actually, this is quite nicely summarized already by another visionary piece by our keynote speaker. Technologies that introduce the equivalent of people, and meaning robots, into our homes, cars, computers, and mobile devices, places historically experienced as private, threaten our dwindling opportunities for solitude, the negative freedom, and self-development, the positive freedom. And what I particularly like here is the element of focusing on the places, not the data, the contents, but on the environments. So if we think of, for instance, intellectual privacy, Neil Richards, in his book on intellectual privacy, has a very nice example on the e-reader paradox. If you read a book on the train, anyone can see what book you read. So if you read 50 Shades of Grey, you might find it embarrassing to read it on the subway for a number of reasons, except maybe in a strange city where you're not recognized, right? With an e-book, people cannot see the book you read, so you might feel far more comfortable reading 50 Shades of Grey on the subway. However, the paradox is that while the other people don't see that you're reading 50 Shades of Grey, actually Amazon, or the e-reader provider, knows exactly which book you're reading, and not only that, it knows how you're reading it and which passages you find particularly interesting. So that is far more intrusive than the people around you just seeing how that you're reading a certain book. So while on the one hand you might find more intellectual privacy with the digital equivalent, actually you have far less mental privacy in the sense of being let alone if the providers of e-books know exactly and following the way you're reading and give you automated recommendations for further reading. Not that that is necessarily wrong, but it does affect to some extent your freedom to self-develop yourself by reading and thinking. A bit similarly, decisional privacy can be quite affected. Decisional privacy typically refers to intimate choices that you make and your freedom to make the choices on who you want to live with, whether you want to have children, what type of family you want to create. And the often repeated example of the father who found out that his daughter was pregnant through supermarket ads. I'm not quite sure whether the story is correct, but it's the classic example by now of AI and its impact. Is one example possibly on those types of choices people want to make. You can also think of Tinder and other types of dating apps where, of course, you might want to select your partner, but the profiles you get to see are to a large extent determined probably by AI analyses by the app provider. So, and of course, although that is to a significant extent an issue of processing data and you're consenting or not to whether the dating provider can process these data, it has significant impact on your intimate life, which I think cannot be purely reduced to the data. Similarly, with associational privacy, which refers to the freedom to select the people you want to engage with and to be in groups that you want to talk with, you could find that if you have personal digital assistants at home, such as Siri or Alexa, although they only turn on when you talk to them you say, Alexa, look up something, they are actually always on. So they have the capability of listening to everything that is being said in that environment. And you could imagine that if you invite people in your home, those people might feel a bit uncomfortable if they know that there is such a thing in the background. So also this might have some effect on the persons you engage with. And similarly, recommendation systems for contacting more people, such as LinkedIn, having this list of you probably know these people as well. Sometimes they have surprising people you might want to engage with. So this has a significant impact on the circle of friends, colleagues, and contacts that you engage with, which might be positive, but it might also be negative. And particularly those people who refuse to be on LinkedIn because they don't like this type of data processing will also be affected in their associational privacy, I think. Five minutes. That's relatively on time. I've already mentioned automated facial recognition. I won't go through all of these. But you can imagine that your freedom to move around, and particularly nowadays you still feel relatively anonymous when you walk around on the streets, particularly in foreign cities, such as me walking here around in Florence. Apart from this conference, I could do whatever I want because I know that whatever I do will not be traced back to me. But with ubiquitous cameras that might upload pictures from me and automatically tag me, I would be significantly restricted in my freedom of movement there. And the thing I particularly focus on in my project is also spatial privacy. Just one fairly telling example. The Hello Barbie doll, which is a doll that is smart because she can really speak with the children. She's able to speak because whatever a child tells the doll is transferred to the cloud of Mattel, who then finds the best answer to reflect back. So that means that Barbie listens to everything that is being said in the bedroom or the living room. One of the reasons why in Germany she has been prohibited and she has been dubbed the Stasi Barbie. And I think with IoT devices, we will get much more of those examples of robots in the home that will have sensors listening, watching, and significantly impact the freedom that you feel to do whatever you like in the privacy of your own home. So the overall conclusion there is when you look through all these examples, it's very easy to find examples of the way that robotics and AI will impact elements of your privacy. And those elements, and that's my main message for today, are not reducible to data protection. They have usually one element of data protection, so the GDPR is relevant in these cases, but it's not the only element that we should look at. We should also focus on the physical elements of privacy that are affected and that are not regulated by the GDPR. So that leaves me with 2.5 minutes. So I'll just spend 1 minute for explaining the two ideas that I currently have for new privacy boundary markers, and we can then use the coffee breaks, dinners, and email discussions for further developing these, because these are very much in development. One is to think of a digital home, meaning a home where you have the whole of your cybernetic space, a very interesting conception from Lorenzo Picotti, where you have the right to exclude others, where you decide who you want to let in and out. As the kind of concept that can feed into many discussions, this is the digital space where you have control. And of course, we have the fiction that with data protection we have control, but actually in the way that it currently works, you don't actually have control because you're not always the ones who really decides who gets to access data. Home 2.0 has two elements. One is that the traditional physical space of the home, which is now far more networked and digitized, as I explained, should be protected by not looking at the walls as physical boundary markers, but also in a more virtual sense to look at all the data flows within the home to protect that space as really exclusive. But it also, and I find that an interesting thing that I would like in the discussions to develop far more, I envision a part of your smartphone and cloud elements as that element where you still have total control on who you want to give access to. That is the parts of cyberspace where you store the things that you used to leave at home, your music, your letters, the things that you do not necessarily want to share with others. And in the current ecosystem, all those things, once you upload them to the cloud, they become accessible to many other parties. And that's something that I think we need to work on. The second boundary marker is even less developed in my current thinking, so that requires a lot of discussion yet to develop. But this is building on the mosaic theory. Many of you will be familiar with that. One piece of data does not tell much, but if you put a lot of pieces of data together, you get a quite revealing picture. And I would like to combine that with a spheres theory that you see in German privacy law and in some other countries as well. For instance, Canada has a conception of the core of biographical data that is higher protected than other elements. And I think this would be a fruitful way of distinguishing between minor, intermediate, and really serious privacy violations, to conceive of pieces of data put together that produce not any image at all, or just an average image, or a very intrusive image of you. And of course, one of the challenges is that it's very difficult to define what exactly that core of privacy is. So that will also be open for discussion.
Thank you so much. I know there's one compelling question, so I would allow for one compelling question, and then we move to the next speaker. Thanks.
Hi, Kate Klonick. I'm at Yale University. So I thought that this was a really great summary of how AI and technology kind of, I would put it in the way of, they remove the transaction costs from our everyday systems of how we engage. And you kind of put it in terms of boundaries, but there have been a number of other scholars, Larry Lessig, Neil Richards, as you mentioned, Dan Solov did this, Shlomo Rabin. I think that there was, Harry Surdin wrote a really great paper about this too, and Margot Kaminsky right there has wrote a number of papers on this kind of stuff. So that might be a place to look for some kind of engagement on some of the ideas that you talked about as you come up with kind of flesh out some of like your solutions that you were getting to at the end. But I kind of want, it seems like you're basically calling for rebuilding transaction costs into this system. And you're doing that by basically saying that like regulation should be this, maybe the GDPR should be more, but you seem to talk in your ideas about kind of private companies or private archetype, like to use a Lessig term, to like an architecture or a code that would build some of these frictions and these transaction costs back into the systems to allow for some of the things that technology is removing. And I want to know what you decide, or who should be deciding which frictions get put back in and which get taken out.
Thank you very much. That's a multiple comment, I think. I appreciate the literature references. I'll look them up. Transaction costs, which get less and less, it's far easier to process data, so that's one of the reasons why privacy is invaded more. And it would be one, I think, very useful solution to increase the transaction costs for certain parties as one way of building it or enforcing the new types of privacy. Actually, what I'm doing is more first finding the ways that you can mark where you would want to increase these transaction costs, for example, rather than how. But implementing this will be a great challenge, and I think that building in new thresholds so to make it more difficult for people to get access to data would be one way, although that is also still abstract. As I said, I particularly specialize in criminal law, so the first element I will look at is in the criminal justice system. So how can we increase the transaction costs for the police, for example, which is completely different, I think, from the private party and the Facebook type of interactions and discussions that we also have. It might be that once you have technical solutions that work in one sector, they would also work in other sectors, but it might again be the case that that really needs sectoral differentiation.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you so much. For the other questions that Berjab mentioned, coffee is welcome. I will now leave the floor to Leonard for his speech on, well, he has an interesting title, Between a Presidential Rock and a Ministerial Hard Place, on AI startups in Europe and the impact of GDPR. The floor is yours, thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks so much for having us again in this wonderful location. You definitely asked me a little bit too early for my title, so I had to come up with something. I hope it still fits on what I have to say. A quick word on who we are. My name is Lennart, and I run our office in Brussels of an organization called Allied for Startups, which is a global network of national and regional startup associations whose mission is to bring the voice of these startups to politics and government. As you also have noted, probably, I'm one of the few that doesn't have the name of a university on his name tag, hoping that I can offer you a bit of a different perspective. I definitely enjoy listening to so many smart people in the room. The assumption which we brought to you today is that the assumption for AI is that startups and not corporates or any other actors are the main source of AI innovation, revolutionary AI innovation, as we heard before. However, that public policy making is focused too much on corporates and not on startups, and hence this complexity may create entry barriers and may ultimately hamper the ambitions of many of the AI strategies that we've seen these days. So even though startups are the ones developing so many of the AI applications that we've seen, they're not usually or not always the ones that make them popular. Examples for that would be Siri on many of your phones, DeepMind or Otto, Uber's automated driving program. Less popular examples include companies like Nieland or Sonalytic that have been acquired by Spotify, which was once a startup as well. It's not only the tech sector that acquires innovation through startups, but also more traditional sectors. Roche bought Flatiron Health for nearly 2 billion euro at the beginning of this year, and Siemens, for example, announced a 10 billion investment to run and drive their digital transformation. So we'd like to think of startups as small, agile, but fast-growing and venture-financed entities, perhaps the most efficient entities to drive innovation on the market. So just to give you a quick snapshot on where we stand on AI startups in Europe specifically, and I'm referring to a Roland Berger study which hopefully be published very soon, and they counted roughly 1,400 AI startups in the US, 769 in the EU, and China on a third place with 384. Which doesn't look so bad. However, the report also highlights that there is a big fragmentation across Europe, so it's hard to make that one block. Funding, however, paints a pretty different picture, where 48% of the global funding of $15 billion went to Chinese companies, nearly 40% went to the US, leaving roughly 20% for Europe plus the rest of the world. We also see that in the size of funding rounds, there haven't been any major funding rounds above 100 million. The last funding round above 100 million was yesterday in China with an autonomous driving startup called Roadstar.ai. Trying to make the loop to the title, so where do we find startups between a presidential rock and a ministerial hard place? Is referring a little bit to some of the recent strategies and ambitions that have been formulated on the highest political level. I'm very glad that Director General Viola is here, and we very much commend the AI strategy, which we believe is a fantastic document, and very happy also to hear that comment to the regulatory sandboxes. Then also the French president has released and has announced a big, has released a big AI strategy recently, and called also for France to become a startup nation. The German coalition agreement makes reference to that, and as many as 25 countries have signed a declaration to cooperate in the field of AI. So this is where we want to be, and all these documents somehow make a reference to startups. They evolve mainly, as we have already heard, around public funding, around ethics, and around the review on the legal frameworks. As I mentioned, they all underline the importance of startups. However, we see that the attention to startups is not equally spread out in these initiatives and in these strategies. But the attention on startups mainly focuses on public funding and general promotion. If you ask governments what they do for startups, they say, well, we have this funding project, and we do so many startup awards. Startup awards, by all means, seem to be the most popular things for policymakers these days. But what we're missing a little bit, and this is where we see the ministerial hard place, is sort of trickling down on these high political ambitions in everyday policymaking, and the right legislative frameworks that could make it easier for newcomers to enter and compete in any given market. So if we continue with the assumption that startups are the main drivers of AI innovation, the overall attractiveness of the EU or other markets as home for artificial intelligence should be judged on their conduciveness for startups and not for larger companies to enter and grow and compete in these markets. I want to make a quick reference to legislative exemptions or carve-outs, because this has a very good tradition across Europe, and I think it's an established tool for small and medium-sized enterprise that wish to stay small and medium-sized enterprise. However, the main difference between an SME and a startup, as we see it, is a startup is ideally small for only a short while in time. This, at the same time, makes it very hard to work with these exemptions. Of course, we also want startups to comply, and not in all legal areas. You certainly know more about this than I. It is advisable to exempt certain groups. So what we're missing and what we need is regulations that are compatible with startups and the way they grow and scale, but also very easy to comply with. This is not really the language that we have seen in the recent legislative files that have been produced in the recent years. The GDPR is one example of them, and obviously I think it's necessary to underline that this is obviously not entirely coming from the European Commission, which is only one part in the legislative process. But with the GDPR being coming into force next week, this is definitely something that is high up on the entrepreneurs' agenda. And the entrepreneurs we spoke to have expressed a few concerns, and these concerns, and I don't want to go, I have listed a few specific cases, but I think three elements combine them very good. Obviously, first, the complexity. So there's no way without a heavy legal counsel to go through the GDPR and its obligations and to transpose some of them. Also, the two specific cases of entrepreneurs we recently spoke to mentioned that in their case, where they're based in Europe, but the majority of their users are outside of Europe, they feel that they have a direct competitive disadvantage to other companies that would be based outside of Europe. As European entrepreneurs, obviously their wish is to remain and to stay in Europe, but we also have to acknowledge that these entrepreneurs are responsible to obviously sound, rational decision making, but also their investors. For one of these entrepreneurs from Sweden, by the way, the GDPR, he says, was nearly a deal breaker, and this is, yeah. So these are two anecdotal experiences that we heard. I think more on a structural level, we see that the role and the contact to DPAs is a very important element. Sort of the question whether the data protection authorities will have the resources, but also the expertise on understanding and judging the data-driven models and AI-driven business models by startups in a timely fashion. And then also the descriptive nature of some of the rules, for example, on the repurposing of data, whether this is or is not related to a heightened risk of the data subject or not. I'm happy to go a little bit deeper into some of the specifics if that is interesting to you. Otherwise, I'd like to mention a second and then perhaps a third file that is being negotiated right now. The one is referring to the letter that you also had in your presentation, the e-privacy regulation. And our impression is that there's a lot of overlaps and sometimes also a lot of similar concepts that are not drafted in a very same way. So what we hear from startup entrepreneurs is that this is perhaps a good opportunity to first collect and learn from the implementation phase of the GDPR, see what works, see what doesn't, before we rush on to another file. And a second example, which refers to text and data mining. Interestingly, I've seen, I'm sure you're all aware, the EUI also offers courses in text and data mining, which is an extremely popular practice in academia. It's also a very popular practice for startups that develop machine learning technologies. Because in the absence of big and proprietary data sets, crawling the web and applying text and data mining is pretty much the only way for a newcomer to enter into market and to develop an own machine learning algorithm. So our bottom line here, our thinking is that again, we very much agree with the ambition, and we believe that the success of all these strategies at the end of the day will depend on the ability of public policymakers to translate them into everyday regulations, where the access to data is provided, and closing with perhaps one question, if I may, to Director General Viola, since you mentioned the high-level expert group. One curiosity for me would also be whether the Commission plans on having startups also represented in this expert group. That would be something we'd be highly welcoming of. And so far, I hope I left some time for questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, super sharp. I would leave the floor to Director Viola, maybe to answer to this question.
Yeah, in the interest of time, I'll be very brief. Yes.
Super good question, super good answer for timekeeping. Is there any other question that you would like to ask? Yes, Alessandro?
It's not a question, it's only a comment. Also working with company. It's only... No, because you mentioned the competitive disadvantage. I started studying data protection law before the directive. And when we introduced the directive, there was this problem of the competitive disadvantages. Every time that we add new pieces of law with regard to data protection, there is always this refrain of competitive disadvantage. I've been a bit skeptical about this competitive disadvantage, and think that is sometimes not correctly framed by many companies. Starting considering the competitive advantages. I carry out in the past empirical studies in the cost of application of Italian data protection regulation, and there are many competitive advantages in many cases in terms of increasing security, increasing quality of data, and right now, if you remember the case of the cloud computing after the NSA case, there was an evident competitive advantages of European companies. So I think that it's a bit of a rhetoric argument, and in many cases, European companies continue to make their business without a great problem and created a better quality in terms of values per citizen and users. That at the end should be more important, from my perspective as fundamental rights, than the competitive potential disadvantage. It's a comment, I'm sorry.
Am I allowed to comment back?
In 1 minute, yes.
So I would just try to be very short on this and saying yes on the competitive advantage of data protection, question mark on the competitive advantage of the GDPR. I think there's always different ways on getting somewhere. At the moment, what we see is we see, for example, media publishers complaining about large platforms dictating to some extent the level playing field and the terms, and we see also a series of blogs closing down. I don't think because they have to, because they simply resignate vis-a-vis the sheer complexity of that text. So I would definitely agree with the principle of data protection, and I welcome all the raised awareness that we as Europeans and basically anyone doing business in Europe has. But the question I'm upholding is more of whether there is a different way to get from A to B.
Thanks a lot. I would give the floor now to Margot.
Thank you. So thank you all for having me. I wanted to give some context for this, this presentation before I start into it. So I'm here on the privacy and cybersecurity panel, and like, I guess, both of my co-panelists, I'm not really going to be talking about privacy. But I want to give some background as to why I'm on the privacy panel. So I'm here in the EU in general under a Fulbright Schumann grant and have been generously hosted at both the University of Amsterdam and now at Scuola Santa Ana in Pisa. And I started, my proposal was to come here and study two fairly substantial differences between the US and the European approach to privacy or data protection. And I just want to tell you what those differences are before I then totally don't talk about them. So one of those differences is that in the United States, and these are relevant to robotics and AI, one of those differences is that in the United States, our primary approach to data protection is a consumer protection model, and I'm not the first to say that. But the Federal Trade Commission largely regulates data protection or privacy as part of a relationship between a consumer and the company from which they buy a product. And the puzzle this has created in the space of robotics is that you have a lot of situations where a person's privacy is violated by another person's product, and there's no direct relationship between the person whose privacy is harmed and the manufacturer of the product. So Meg Jones has referred to this as the problem of the Internet of Other People's Things, the idea being that I may have protections vis-a-vis my relationship with the manufacturer of the drone that I have purchased, but I don't have any protections vis-a-vis my neighbor's use of that drone. That's a grand summary, but that's sort of what happens in the US. In the EU, totally not the case. Protection travels with data, doesn't travel. It's not conditioned on that relationship between the consumer and the manufacturer. Okay, second big difference is obviously freedom of expression, except I was interested in studying a sub-part of this, which is the question of the First Amendment right to record. And again, very, very broadly speaking, the big difference between the US and the EU, you use proportionality analysis here, so you balance freedom of expression against other rights, and in the US we don't really do that, we use categorical analysis. And the second big difference is that there's press exceptionalism in the EU. You treat the press as having more free expression protections, and in the US we're not supposed to do that. Okay, that was the project I was going to do. I didn't end up doing that at all. I started reading papers about the GDPR, which is dangerous, and I ended up on a project that's now taken me 5 months that focuses instead on the Article 22 right to explanation, which I'd argue should actually really be characterized as the Article 22 right to algorithmic due process. And this created this project that then moved beyond the GDPR and just became a project in general about trying to clarify what is going on in the legal policy space about algorithmic decision making. And so this both illuminated features of the existing GDPR system or about to be implemented GDPR system, and because I'm doing comparative work, provides a potential model for regulation in the United States if we ever regulate anything ever again. So you all know the problem of algorithmic decision making, or at least the puzzle. The idea is you have this algorithm, usually a machine learning algorithm, that is used to make a significant decision about a human being. It's important that it's a significant decision, so the examples that are usually provided are the employment context, the credit context, the school context. And machine learning algorithms, it turns out, as you all know very well, are extremely challenging to regulate for a variety of reasons. They're complex and they're opaque, technologically complex. They're also opaque in the sense that even their makers can't predict what they're going to do. They change over time. They're iterative, which makes them extremely hard to govern because you create one set of rules for one version of the algorithm, and then down the line it's going to immediately change. And there's a growing technological consensus that it's better, and again, I'm not a technologist, so technologists, please push back against this if you think it's wrong, that it's better to build features into the systems as they're being designed than it is to try to go back and impose accountability post facto. So calls for regulating algorithmic decision-making, both in the US and the EU, stem really from three types of rationales. The first is the dignitary rationale, which you're very familiar with in Europe, but I'll break that down a little further. The second is a justificatory rationale, which again, I'll get back to in a second. And the third is really an instrumental rationale. And what I found in this project is that people writing in the area or coming up with policy proposals are often speaking past each other because they're arguing from one rationale and somebody's responding from another. So what do I mean by this? The dignitary rationale is about preventing the objectification of an individual. And the versions of objectification that we see, there's one that's quintessentially European, this is in the Article 15 of the Data Protection Directive, is this idea that a machine-made decision will inherently objectify a human being. That is, if you don't have another human being making the decision, full stop, your dignity is violated. This is not a commonly shared understanding of dignitary violations from the US perspective. Second, and this is a little bit more complex, there's the idea that a lack of individualization objectifies a person. So if you make a decision based on the fact that somebody falls into a particular category, that is, you use correlative reasoning instead of causal reasoning and say, you look like all the other people who have committed this crime, therefore you must be like all the other people who have committed this crime, and you don't allow the individual to push back and say, no, actually I'm different, that's a form of objectification and that violates human dignity. And then the third comes out of privacy law scholarship is this idea that having this data double somewhere there in the ether is a form of objectification, in that the profile that exists about me exists without my participation, exists without my input, and therefore objectifies me in a real sense that I have this sort of digital object version of myself out there on which decisions are being made. So the justificatory rationale is a little different, right? The justificatory rationale is actually about rule of law. And that's saying that we want to regulate algorithms because we want to be able to see the reasoning on the basis of which decisions are made. And this breaks down into sort of two subcategories of justification. One is the show me your rationale so I can decide whether they're good. And the other is the closely related idea that show me that you are accountable to somebody who in turn is doing that judging. And then the instrumental rationale, which has really become the dominant force behind calls for algorithmic regulation, says that we have to regulate in order to prevent certain types of algorithmic failures, whether it's preventing algorithmic decision-making systems from making errors, from failing or crashing in spectacular ways, from being biased, or from being discriminatory or otherwise violating privacy. So what you're seeing happen, or what I've been seeing happen, is that people make calls for regulating algorithmic decision-making based on a dignitary rationale, and others respond and say, nope, we shouldn't put in place certain protections because that's not an effective way of getting at these instrumental goals. So I'll get to that in a second. So I propose, and this is modeled on the GDPR, this idea of what I'm calling binary governance. This is a two-part governance system where you use algorithmic due process on the one hand to get at dignitary and justificatory issues, and you use collaborative governance on the other to get at those instrumental goals, to create an algorithmic decision-making system that is free of error, bias, discrimination, et cetera, or as close as we can get to free. So I'm going to skim algorithmic due process because most of you are probably familiar with this. This is stemming from great work by Paul Schwartz, Danielle Citron, Frank Pasquale, and to some also Kate Crawford and Jason Schultz. And it calls for basically a form of governance over algorithmic decision-making that puts in place notice and an opportunity to be heard. So I get told I don't get a job because an algorithm said so. I have the opportunity to say, okay, well, I know about this decision, and I'm going to get to contest that decision. The problem with algorithmic due process, it does help with dignitary concerns because I now get to participate in the formulation of my data double. It does help address justificatory concerns because it gives me the basis on which the decision was made. It's absolutely terrible at addressing instrumental concerns. So if you talk to somebody who is trying to eliminate error from a system or trying to eliminate discrimination from a system, they're going to tell you what we really need is oversight over time at an earlier stage in algorithmic development that's going to get at building a better system as opposed to trying post facto and one-off to regulate the system. So prong 2 of binary governance is this idea of collaborative governance or new governance. And this is the idea that you deliberately use public-private partnerships to delegate governance to the private sector. It is definitively not self-regulation, and anybody who looks at the GDPR can agree with me. While it has a lot of collaborative aspects, it definitely is not just leaving a deregulated space. So in practice, what this involves is a combination of formal versions of collaborative governance, such as codes of conduct, standards, certification, with informal versions, which include things like stating a broad standard in the text, like algorithms must be fair, and then in back and forth conversation between regulators and the companies, coming up with what that might look like in practice. All right, so this type of governance is much better suited, or this is touted as being better suited for governing risk-based systems, fast-changing systems, iterative systems, technologically complex systems, et cetera. The key to having a collaborative governance system that works is accountability, because if you don't have any form of public accountability, then you end up with a system that effectively is self-regulatory or possibly deregulatory. If you let private sector entities come up for themselves with the rules that govern them, you risk having incredibly self-serving rules. So you want a system that's going to produce both substantively good outcomes and publicly acceptable or legitimate outcomes. In the interest of time, I'm actually going to skim through this and get to the punchline about the GDPR. So the GDPR has these two phases, if you look at it in detail. It has an individual rights phase on the one hand in Article 22, which is a form of algorithmic due process that goes beyond the right to explanation and includes a right to contest and a right to object. And the other prong are these series of duties that are imposed on companies and include duties that are going to be constituted later on through the process of collaborative governance. And the big puzzle for the GDPR, skip over that, is that, the big puzzle for the GDPR is that for you to have good collaborative governance, you have to have this intensely structured accountability, right? You can't just have the private sector. You can't just have the private sector in conversation with regulators. What you need to have is some sort of tripartism or third-party participation that provides oversight over the constituting of those rules. The problem for the GDPR is it's not actually a public transparency law. It's not a freedom of expression law, and it's not meant to be. So you have these various provisions in Articles 13 and 14 that are notice and access rights for individuals that let individuals have access to certain elements of algorithmic decision-making, including, oh, the screen just died, including meaningful information about the logic involved. But, it's okay, I'm done. But you don't have any form of public, you don't have any form of fully public transparency, nor do you have any form of really in-depth transparency to experts. The Article 29 Working Party in this area has tried to ameliorate this by suggesting that one thing companies might do is incorporate expert boards or start using third-party auditing, et cetera. But those are sort of guideline-based recommendations and not required in the immediate text. So the real puzzle for the GDPR is whether its system of collaborative governance, where they task companies with the prospect of coming up with what a right to human contestation will look like, what suitable protections for the data subject right will look like, whether that's actually going to, in practice, produce good law if you don't have tripartism or public transparency. Thank you.
Couldn't believe you went so fast. So congrats. Take a bit of water. But apart from this, I mean, great presentation. Thanks a lot, and giving a little bit the twist also to other perspective. Is there any question on the presentation? Ryan, sure.
I have a question for, I think really for all the panelists, but I'm going to direct it initially at Margot, which is, where do asymmetries of information and power, how do they play out on your account, right? So when I think about the GDPR and what it's trying to accomplish is it's basically a recognition, much more deeply than in the United States, that there are these vast asymmetries of power information if you're firms versus individuals. And so when I see provisions like access and portability, I can take my stuff and go and use the market to vote, DPOs who are supposed to be sort of designates of the populace and who have an elevated role and therefore act on behalf and privacy by design and so on. I think of these as each mechanisms by which to address asymmetry. And therefore I read the, this work as well, this sort of accountability, algorithmic accountability in the same mode. But I struggled to find, in your rationales for algorithmic explainability, what role you thought asymmetry might fit. It's not exactly a dignitary issue, and I wasn't sure that I saw it in the justificatory or the instrumental approach either. But the reason it's a broader question is I wonder, whether other people believe that that's what's going on. I mean, in a sense, Bert, you also didn't mention precisely asymmetries of information and power as part of your very extensive taxonomy. Does that resonate with you? That sort of feels like what's going on to me.
Yeah, so I do think, and actually in the paper draft version of this, I talk a little bit about how information asymmetries or other forms of power asymmetries map onto some of the dignitary arguments. But I am less of a pure law and econ person, and so I don't play with those terms as much. So I think there's something to be said for information asymmetry is a crucial challenge to individual autonomy. Individual autonomy is a component of individual dignity. And then in terms of looking at the GDPR as a whole as trying to solve these problems, I think you're absolutely right that that's a goal. There's sort of looking at it from this perspective of being a dual system, right? Having individual rights, but also these collaborative governance constituted duties shows a potential for extreme failure, to sound an incredibly optimistic note. And that's that the GDPR, Article 12 says you have to communicate things in a way that individuals understand. And that's targeted at having individuals be more individually empowered in making these choices and exercising these various rights. But doing that simplifies greatly the transparency responsibilities that a company has. It makes the company have to go through the work of explaining things, but it also means a company can say, nope, I'm not going to give you all this information because you're not capable of understanding it. And there's explicit language in some of the guidance documents saying if you flood an individual with information, that's effectively the same thing as, this is kind of to your point earlier about transparency versus comprehensibility. It might be transparency, but nobody understands what you're saying. And so that provides that sort of information asymmetry vis-a-vis the individual who has rights they can act on, provides an excuse that companies can potentially use to not release information that could provide expert oversight and policy input on a complex system.
And there was a question by you.
Could I briefly respond as well? Because it was partly addressed to me, and I think I would follow up by broadening the answer a little bit, although that might be going a bit beyond the question. Actually, I think that much of law, not all of law, but much of law is about inequality compensation. So to address the issues of power asymmetries, part of the law just regulates how processes are. It helps that cars drive on the right side or all on the left side, but not anything goes. That has little to do with power asymmetries, but many areas of law do have the aim of sort of rebalancing the factual inequalities that exist, and constitutional rights are primarily there, and privacy is a very good example in general, I think, of a way to address the power asymmetries that exist. And my work partly looks at the fact that we tend to overlook that the way that the law as it is was meant to address power asymmetries based in a certain technological and social context, and that when the technological and social context really changes, the same laws don't help to address the power asymmetries that exist in the new world. And so part of what I try to do is to look at whether the new opportunities of getting access to people's private spheres have gaps in the law, so that we can fill in those new examples of power asymmetries.
There was one question, yes, from Mike. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Margot. That was an incredibly interesting presentation. I think really revealing both in terms of showing these different rationales where people talk against each other, and also naming this dual system, which is something I've been thinking about, but couldn't really find a word for that. So thank you for that. And my question would be to you, so what do you think we should do? Because I agree that there is this blind spot in a sense that we're doing in a different project we have now. the work we're doing is we're trying to automate analysis of privacy policies. And to do that, we need to tag the privacy policies. And to do that, we needed to define an instruction and, in a certain extent, create an ideal privacy policy. And there is this inherent clash that Article 29 group has acknowledged between plain and intelligible language and being understandable to data subjects and being comprehensive. And so many of so now we're reading dozens of privacy policies, and many of them, on one hand, are good, right, if they give you an example, on the other are really not comprehensive. And the problem that we're facing is exactly what you said, is that on one hand, there are individuals who have rights to get certain information. That's great for them, and we want them to sort of understand something. On the other, there is a robust accountability system that works only when the DPA comes and says, okay, show me, right? So they are supposed to keep it there, but the problem is that, at least in Europe, the way we do it, for example, in consumer law, is we have the whole civil society control, no? When it's not the individual consumers asking for it, but the NGOs who are put out there to actually do it if the national agencies don't have time or don't have whatever. And if we want to automate it, it would be nice to have that information as well. So I agree there is a blind spot. I think it sort of was certain conceptual shortcoming of the GDPR, and my question to you would be, do you think we just will need to amend the regulation, or is there any somehow other non-legal way of fixing that?
Yeah, so I do think that there are a number of hooks that are suggestive in the GDPR and in the Article 29 Working Party's guidelines that are not mandatory, but if authorities sort of look at them and say, you know, these are things that you really should actually be doing, they could go a considerable way towards fixing some of these problems. So, for example, in the guidelines on algorithmic decision-making, the Working Party talks about instituting third-party audits. They also talk about a best practice of putting in place, when you're doing high-risk processing, some form of expert ethical board. They talk about best practices of when you're a company and you're licensing software from a third-party company, getting that third party to promise that they'll do third-party audits. So there are all these sort of little hooks in the system. The other place where this could really happen, I think it's fascinating. There's a line of policy literature actually coming from AI now in the United States that's hooked onto the impact assessments as being an incredibly potentially valuable policy tool. But they don't seem to realize that the GDPR impact assessments are not released to the public. And so in the US, if you have an impact assessment, the idea is you release it to the public, it triggers market mechanisms, it triggers other forms of like naming and shaming by civil society. And here, it's suggested that you release to the public, but you don't have to, and not only that, it's suggested that you release a summary of the impact assessment to the public, not like the actual details of the impact assessment. And that's to protect the collaborative relationship between the DPA and the company, but it does that at the significant cost of not involving civil society or external experts. So you could have data protection authorities say, actually what we think should happen is the norm should be release these things. The norm should be that you involve data subjects in a meaningful way when you're producing these things, et cetera. So there's a lot of sort of normative guideline fill-in-the-blanks work that data protection authorities could do, but they can only do that if they see the problem as an actual problem. Oh, and one last thing. I heard this at CPDP. You could use freedom of information law to try to get the impact assessments.
Okay, so before, yes, just a comment and then.
I think that is a good example I think it's helpful to look outside the box if you look for legal instruments. Yeah? So at the EU level, it is helpful to look at the Directive on Unfair Commercial Practices and at the guidelines that the European Commission has published. Because what you could argue, just from a legal point of view, you could say, okay, if there is such accountability mechanism missing towards the public, then this is misleading. You're misleading the public. And there is a similar debate on what online platforms have to do. Yeah? So I think if you look for means, then it's not just enough to look into the data protection regulation. I understand it as an economic order, yeah? So you can use all sorts of instruments.
Thank you so much. There was the last question here. You wanted to ask a question? Yeah.
Thank you. Could you expand a bit on how this perspective allows to tackle the change over time problem? Thank you. Could you expand a little bit on how this perspective tackles the change over time of technology problem? Thank you.
The idea that collaborative governance is better suited to regulating change over time. So this is like a fairly deep literature in the United States. It looks at examples from workplace health, environmental law, chemical regulations, and those sort of things. And the idea is that if you address the problem by dealing with management infrastructure, and also in extensive literature in privacy law, if you address the problem by dealing with putting in place a certain management infrastructure and certain compliance structures within a company, then that creates these iterative processes as opposed to just coming up with one rule that you then have like a high cost of going back and changing. So the example in the GDPR is you put in place a data protection officer. You have the requirement that you have to do iterative data protection impact assessments. You go through and you say, okay, these are our goals. We're going to try to put in these risk mitigation strategies, and then you come back and assess whether it's actually working later on, and it becomes iterative as opposed to just one rule-based system.
Thank you so much. If there are no other questions, I think we can break for the coffee break. What time should we be back? Okay, so the coffee break is not there yet?
We are actually ahead of time, which is not common, but no, it will be served in like 3 minutes, so if everybody can be back 25 past, that would be great.
Thank you.